Thank you. Welcome everyone to today's Urban Nonpoint Source and Stormwater Construction Grant Program webinar. And because that's a long name, I am going to refer to this as the UNPS or Urban Construction Grant for the rest of the presentation. So we're covering the application cycle for the calendar year 2023 grant awards. And my name is Joanna Griffin. I am the Runoff Management Grants Program Coordinator at the Wisconsin DNR. So the agenda for today's webinar includes an overview of the Urban Construction Grant Program, and then things to keep in mind when applying for a grant. As part of the overview of the Urban Construction Grant Program, I'll go over the following: resources, eligible applicants, existing urban area, eligible activities, eligible expenses, reimbursement, and land acquisition. Our Urban Grant website can be found by going to the main DNR website and typing UNPS in the search bar. Here you'll find linked tabs with information, applications, and important forms, and links to relevant laws. The Urban Nonpoint Source Construction Grant Program exists under the authority established in Statute 281.66 and Chapter NR 155. NR 154 identifies best management practices, technical standards, and cost share conditions that apply to the department, state agencies, governmental units, the Board of Regents, and cost share recipients when serving to provide or receive cost share funds under Chapter NR 153 or NR 155. Here's a map of the regional non-point source coordinators who work with urban grants. I'm the statewide coordinator, but the staff here are your main contacts for specific projects and grants in your counties. And I'll come back to this later in the presentation as well. As I mentioned in the previous slide, I'm the grants coordinator. I work on the following: grant eligibility issues, application forms, application instructions, intake, scoring and ranking, and allocations. Your regional non-point source coordinator also helps you with grant eligibility issues, pre-application project discussions, screening of applications, final reports, and reimbursements. And we also have a grants manager, Corrine Johnson. Corrine works with grant eligibility, allocations, awards, amendments, and reimbursements, and all parts of the grant process once the grant is awarded. This is the grant timeline. Grant applications and instructions are posted on our website around January 15th of every year. This year we posted them before the holiday weekend on the 14th. Today is February 15th, where we're presenting grant application webinars. Grant applications are due on April 15th of every year. And between April 15th and July 15th, grant applications are screened, scored, and ranked. The preliminary ranked list with draft funding lines will be presented at the August Land and Water Conservation Board meeting, along with the preliminary joint allocation plan. In some years, this may be pushed back to the October meeting if the budget isn't available by July. The final ranked list will hopefully be presented to the Land and Water Conservation Board in October, and grant awards will be given in late 2022 for funding beginning in January 2023. So I'm going to pause here in case there are any questions related to grant resources.
Hey, Joanna, I'm not seeing any questions right now, but this is a good chance just to remind folks that if you do have questions, please use the chat box and direct those to the Q&A monitor.
All right. So eligible applicants include cities, villages, towns, counties, regional planning commissions, tribal governments, special purpose lake, sewer, or sanitary districts. So here's a summary of the urban construction grants that I will refer to a few times in this presentation. In general, the urban construction grants reimburse up to 50% of eligible expenses, up to a maximum award of $150,000 for construction of eligible BMPs that control urban nonpoint and stormwater runoff pollution from existing urban areas, and for other eligible associated costs and ancillary activities. Urban construction grants reimburse up to 50% of the cost of land acquisition, up to an additional award of $50,000 for land acquisition required for the installation of an eligible BMP constructed as part of the same urban construction grant project. The grant period is 2 years. Most grant awards start January 1st of the calendar year following application. So if you submit an application this April and are awarded a grant, your grant award period would be January 1st, 2023 to December 31st, 2024. A 1-year extension may be requested. So next, I'm going to provide some general information about the construction grants and go into more detail about the terms in this summary. The Urban Construction Grant Program can reimburse construction of eligible best management practices, or BMPs, and associated activities. So let's look at the eligible BMPs. Per NR 155.151D, eligible BMPs are urban best management practices included in Chapter NR 154, or those that have technical standards developed and disseminated in accordance with Subchapter 5 of Chapter NR 151. This slide lists those BMPs that currently meet this requirement and the corresponding technical standard that applies to each. So the BMPs listed on this slide are the BMPs eligible for reimbursement under the Urban Construction Grant Program. You can find these standards on the DNR Stormwater website by clicking on the Technical Standards Models and BMPs shown here in red. And then once you click on that, you will select the post-construction standards outlined in red on this slide. So the post-construction standards looks like this. Here's a list of those standards, and details of each standard can be found by clicking on the PDF. Here's an example of one of the technical standards. Wet detention pond is one of the most cost-effective options for achieving pollutant load reductions and is the BMP most commonly proposed in urban construction grant projects. Keep in mind that these all have quite a bit of text associated with each practice, like shown here. And they may contain images and drawings as well. So let's go back to the explanation of Urban Construction Grant Program. In addition to eligible BMPs, the Urban Construction Grant can also reimburse other eligible associated costs and ancillary activities. The other eligible costs and ancillary activities eligible for cost share reimbursement under the Urban Construction Project are specified in the application and shown on this slide. On the top row, we see grass swales and vegetated pre-treatment filter strips are both eligible for reimbursement. These are not eligible as standalone BMPs, but rather as required as part of an eligible BMP. For example, the technical standard for several of the eligible infiltration BMPs includes a pre-treatment vegetated filter strip. So vegetated filter strip is eligible if it's part of an urban construction project that includes construction of an eligible infiltration BMP. Additionally, if it's necessary to reroute an existing stormwater to direct stormwater to a new BMP constructed under the project, or to remove an existing structure, those costs are reimbursable expenses, but they are not reimbursable as standalone activities. Engineering expenses associated with the construction of eligible BMPs constructed as part of a construction grant project are eligible. However, urban construction grants are funded with state bond revenue. State bond revenue can only be used to fund engineering of constructed BMPs. So this means that we're unable to reimburse engineering designs until after the BMPs are constructed and installed. So even though engineering is the first step of the project, it cannot be reimbursed until the project is complete. Furthermore, if a BMP is designed but never installed, for whatever reason, the engineering costs cannot be reimbursed. DNR will also fund one high efficiency, or will only fund one high efficiency sweeper per municipality. The cost sharing for the sweeper only covers 50% of the incremental difference between the cost of a high efficiency sweeper and a conventional broom sweeper. Another thing to point out about urban construction grants is that eligible BMPs must control runoff pollution from existing urban areas. So let's look at the definition of what we mean by existing urban. Per 281.663 Wisconsin Stats, to be considered an existing urban area, the area must have met the definition of urban since on or before October 1st, 2004. The definition can include residential, commercial, and industrial land use if these land uses meet certain criteria. For urban construction projects, the project area that must meet this definition is the area served by the BMPs specifically. Residential urban areas must have a population of greater than 1,000 and a population density of 1,000 persons per square mile. The population density must correlate to the project area. So if the project area covers only part of the governmental unit, then the density calculation should be based on the population and area within the project area boundary. The population shall be determined by the latest decennial census or by a subsequent population estimate under Statute 16.96. Commercial land use is also classified as urban. This includes governmental, institutional, transportation, and even recreational uses. If they contain sources such as parking lots, streets, storage areas, large landscaped areas that generate an above average amount of rainfall runoff volumes and/or pollutant loads. Manufacturing and non-manufacturing industrial source areas are classified as urban. Urban construction grants can fund BMPs that treat runoff from industrial areas not covered by an industrial stormwater discharge permit. So examples of such eligible areas would include employee parking areas or landscaped areas not contaminated with industrial activity. Also, urban construction grants can fund BMPs on islands of land completely surrounded by the urban area types above. So let's go back to the description of the grant program. Urban construction grants can reimburse up to 50% of eligible expenses. The amount eligible for cost sharing is the amount of the total project costs that are eligible up to 50% cost share reimbursement. The amount eligible for cost sharing is different than the grant award amount, as the grant award itself is 50% or less of the amount of the eligible project costs. Eligible project costs differ from total project costs in that the total project costs may include construction activities that are not eligible for cost share reimbursement. If we look at the budget table from the application, we can see that the header rows of column B and C ask the applicant to enter the total project cost and the amount eligible for cost sharing. This is the same as the eligible expense. So these two columns are sometimes confusing. The reimbursement or award amount is 50% of the amount eligible for cost sharing. And in some cases, the total project costs and the eligible project costs are equal. This slide lists some examples of situations in which the total project costs are greater than the amount eligible. For example, if a portion of the area served by the eligible BMP does not meet the definition of existing urban development, then only the urban areas of the BMP watershed are eligible for cost sharing. Total project costs versus eligible project costs can be determined by prorating the eligible versus ineligible areas served by a BMP. If the eligible BMP is designed to serve both water quality and flood control functions, only the water quality portion of the BMP is eligible for cost sharing. And again, the total cost should be prorated. For some practices, only the incremental difference between the cost of the typical approach versus the water quality approach are eligible. For example, this grant program does not provide funding to communities that need a new street sweeper. However, if they decide to purchase a type of street sweeper that can reduce runoff pollution, then the incremental difference between the cost of a new mechanical broom sweeper and a high efficiency sweeper is eligible for cost sharing. Let's look at an example. In this case, the BMP selected is a wet detention pond. The estimated total cost is $100,000, which is in column B. All of that cost is eligible for DNR cost sharing, entered into column C. The maximum state share is 50%. Oops. And the requested state share can be up to the maximum. So in this example, they requested all 50,000. So let's return to our explanation of the program description. Urban construction is a reimbursement grant program. So this means that no money is reimbursed until the grantee has constructed a BMP. Note there are other important steps in between the DNR issuing grant awards and the final reimbursement. A grantee is required to submit their professional services agreement and construction plans and specs to the DNR for review before the project is constructed. So in step one, the DNR issues a grant award. Then the grantee submits the engineering professional service agreement, or PSA, to DNR for approval. DNR then issues approval of the PSA. The grantee completes the design of the project and pays the engineer. Then the grantee submits construction plans and specs for DNR review and approval. DNR issues approval of the construction plans and specs. The grantee constructs the project and pays in full. Then the grantee requests reimbursement of the state share amount from DNR. DNR reimburses the grantee for the state share amount, and the grantee receives the state share reimbursement. Let's go back to the description. We see in the second bullet that the land acquisition is also eligible for cost share reimbursement if land acquisition is required for construction of an eligible BMP. Land acquisition funding is available for projects that also include funding for BMP construction. Land acquisition cannot be a standalone project, and funding is not granted solely for the acquisition of easements or fee title purchase of property. Land acquisition can take the form of a land purchase and fee title or conservation easements. Eligible acquisition costs include appraisals, land surveys, relocation payments, title and evidence, recording fees, historical and cultural assessments as required by the DNR, and environmental inspections and assessment. Keep in mind that once a property or easement is purchased through a construction grant, the grantee will hold the title to the land and permanently assume the implied responsibilities. An acquisition proposal is required for projects that include land acquisition. The acquisition proposal must include items which are provided in the instructions. These are a map, schedule eligible BMPs that will be constructed on the property. An appraisal is required for any property or easement purchase through a construction grant as part of the urban construction project. And there's several requirements related to appraisals, which are also detailed in the instructions. So let's go over a couple of typical questions. Is a salt storage shed eligible for cost sharing under a urban construction grant? We know that winter de-icing management is an element of municipal MS4 permits. So to answer this question, we need to remember that according to NR 155.151D, eligible BMPs are urban best management practices included in Chapter NR 154, or those that have technical standards developed and disseminated in accordance with Subchapter 5 of Chapter NR 151. So let's look back at the list of eligible BMPs that meet that criteria. We don't see a salt storage shed here, so maybe it's an ancillary activity. No, it is not listed here either, so the salt storage shed is not eligible. Here's another example. Can I add an aerator to the pond? What if the project didn't cost as much as I budgeted and the grant has underspending? Can I use it to put an aerator in the pond? So how would we go about figuring out the answer to this question? Remember, eligible BMPs are those constructed according to standards. So let's look at the list of those eligible BMPs again. If the wet detention pond was the eligible BMP in the grant, we can then refer to the technical standard. In this case, it's 1001. So we know that from NR 154 that a wet detention pond must be designed according to technical standard 1001. And here it says, oops, that aerators and fountains designed to mix the contents of the pond are prohibited. And if an aerator or fountain is desired for visual and other aesthetic effects, the pond must meet certain requirements detailed in the text of the technical standard. If the pond is designed according to these standards, then an aerator is okay, but the aerator itself may not be an eligible cost if it's for aesthetics. So there may be some circumstances when an aerator is eligible, but in many cases it will not be. So I'm going to pause here again for some questions since I just went over a lot of material here.
All right, Joanna, yeah, we do have a couple of questions.
Okay.
First one is, can nonprofits apply?
No, it needs to be a governmental unit that is the applicant. But we have situations where, you know, a nonprofit may work with a governmental unit as part of a project.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. This is just more about the webinar today, but will the slides be made available after the presentation? Now we're going to have the recording, but could we also provide the slides?
I think so. I think we did something like that before, but I will look into that.
All right, very good. Another question came in. Can land acquired via eminent domain be eligible for reimbursement through this program if it is associated with the construction of an eligible BMP? Are legal fees reimbursable expenses?
I can take that one, Joanna, if you want.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's okay.
I do.
This is Corrine Johnson, the Nonpoint Source Program Grant Manager. I'm pretty sure we can verify this in code in NR 155, but I'm pretty sure that property acquired via eminent domain is not eligible for reimbursement through the Urban Nonpoint Grant Program. And Legal fees in general are not, but in terms of property acquisition there too, we can verify in code if that is something that is eligible. I don't think it is, but we can certainly follow up and check back with you on that. We don't do a lot of property acquisition in the Nonpoint grant program, so it's one of those things where we have to kind of refer back and verify.
Sounds good. We'll make a note in our questions notes here about following up on that question. I'm not seeing any other questions right now, so I think you are set to move on to the next section.
All right. So now we're going to go into the second part of the webinar and go over things to keep in mind when applying for an urban construction grant. So first, is this a correct application and is your project eligible? So here I've listed a few questions to think about before beginning the grant application process. The answers to these questions will help you and your Nonpoint source coordinator figure out if you're applying for the appropriate grant and if your project is eligible. Are you trying to address a stormwater runoff problem? Which BMPs do you have planned? Are you a local unit of government? Is the project in a TMDL area? And how do you plan to meet the TMDL goals in this project? Is this an urban area? Is it existing urban or new development? What is the water quality need? Are you trying to meet your WPDES permit requirements? Do you have jurisdiction over the project area or do you need an intergovernmental agreement? I have been receiving quite a few questions about our two types of urban grant programs. We have the Urban Construction Program, which is what this webinar has been focused on. And we also have an Urban TMDL Trim Grant Program. And there are a few similarities and differences, and I'm going to point out some of the major ones here. Both the instructions for both these programs are on our website for more details. So the Urban Trim Grant Project must be in an approved TMDL. Both projects for both types need to address existing urban development, but the Urban Construction Grant Project must also be in an urban area, which is what I described before. For residential, it was 1,000 or more people per square mile, or industrial commercial, and or the island. The total funding caps differ. So for trim grants, we have a funding cap of $225,000. And for our urban construction grants, it's $150,000 plus an additional $50,000 for land acquisition. The cost share rates also differ. For trim grants, depending on the practice, it's 50 to 70%, and then 90% if there's economic hardship. But for our urban construction grants, it's a 50% cost share rate. And the other big difference is that trim grants may not be used for NR 216 permit compliance. So what makes a good application? Section NR 155 1.192B of Wisconsin Administrative Code lists the required key project components for subscores of these grants. In accordance with the Administrative Code, urban construction grant application scores are based on those elements. Applicants may score lower in some components, but may not have the ability to improve scores in those sections because of the location or permit status. Water quality need is one of the highest scoring components, and impaired water has received the most points. Within the impaired water quality category, TMDLs receive the highest score, and this is because a TMDL analysis provides additional information and helps target implementation. The application places equal importance on groundwater and surface water. Because the water quality need components are based on project location, applicants do not have the ability to modify these scores. A summary based on the 2021 grant application shows there are other sections of the application form where applicants can provide better answers and improve their scores. The following components are those areas where many applicants can improve upon. So the use of additional funding, project evaluation strategy, extent of pollution control or planning data and source targeting, and the local implementation multiplier. The scores in these areas make up the largest percentage of the total. So increasing scores in these will have a bigger impact than increasing scores in other sections. And lastly, scores may increase or decrease based on how the questions were answered. Some questions on the application forms require a narrative response and are more qualitative. And in those cases, scores are based on things such as, was a question answered? To what extent was a question answered? How much detail was provided? Were all components addressed? And was the answer clear? So here are a few more tips for writing a good application. Include a detailed project budget and schedule. The application should be internally consistent. So each part of the application is consistent with each of the other sections. So make sure each eligible BMP and other eligible activities are described in the project scope, listed as milestones in the project schedule, and major activities in the budget with detailed sub-activities for each major activity. The application should include as much detail as possible about the project, including concept level BMP designs if possible. If they're not completed, provide a sketch of the proposed BMPs on an aerial photo. The applicant should have built local support for the project and included documentation of local support by citizens and local government for specific project activities. And there should be documentation of local share in an existing or proposed budget. So budgeted local share is not the same as local funding source. So there's a section of the application that asks for the source of the local funding. And here you could say something like stormwater utility or general fund. And that would be an appropriate answer. However, budgeted local share is something different. It's actually showing the budget of the funding source with local share budgeted. If you write only stormwater utility for the budgeted local share, you won't earn any points for that section. Now we'll talk about navigable water and a few other items. So the DNR will not fund any urban stormwater practice located in a navigable water or wetland, regardless of whether the practice is being installed to meet a WPDES stormwater permitting requirement. The applicant is required to consult the information sources listed to answer the navigable waters and wetlands filter questions on the application. You're not required to have a Chapter 30 permit with the application, but if it's clearly not permittable, don't apply. And if you're not sure, contact your local water management specialist. If the project includes excavation or purchase of land or easement, the applicant must submit the Environmental Hazards Assessment Form, which is DNR Form 1800-001. And if your project is selected for funding, evidence that the unit of government has budgeted for the local share must be submitted in a timely manner, or the department will not award a grant without this confirmation. So next is a reminder to identify and establish an authorized representative. You will need to identify and establish your governmental authorized representative. The authorized responsible government official is the only person who will be able to sign and submit grant agreements, amendment requests, reimbursement claims, and interim and final reports on behalf of the grantee. An executed Government Responsibility Resolution, or GRR, is required to establish the authorized responsible government official. And if you don't have one, you might need to get it on an appropriate council or board meeting agenda. Sometimes it can take a few months to get that set up. We also recommend using a job title rather than a name in the authorizing resolution. For example, something such as city manager or director of public works. So you won't need to execute a new GRR if and when there is staff turnover. A city engineer is okay as long as the engineer is an employee of the grantee. Consultants or contractors cannot be an authorized responsible government official. This slide here shows the GRR template to be used by grantees in establishing the authorized rep. The GRR must include the language in the red box. So even if you want to use your own format for the GRR, please include the bullets because they're required in the red box here. Remember that contacting your regional non-point source coordinator is required as part of the grant application. So contact the coordinator early. Don't wait until the week before. Contact should include a discussion of at least the following: project eligibility, proposed BMPs, permits and other feasibility issues, and water quality need. So leaving a voicemail or sending an email is not the same thing as having a discussion. Here is the map again of the non-point source coordinators for your area. And I can come back to this later if anyone wants to see it again. And lastly, I'm going to go over what's changed since the last grant cycle. So we fixed the minor errors. We reformatted all the application instructions to be more consistent with other DNR documents. We added a new filter question verifying that the project site is not specifically listed in an approved adaptive management plan under NR 217.18 or a water quality trading plan pursuant to Statute 283.84. And the resulting reductions will not be credited towards the achievement of any WPDES requirement or performance goal, except for a municipal stormwater permittee permitted under Chapter 1 of NR 216. So completing an activity to comply with their municipal stormwater permit. We also added a new alternative funding checkbox option so the applicant can request that DNR also submit a copy of the application to the upcoming sewer overflow and stormwater reuse municipal grant program. We now have easier electronic submission, and we've provided instructions on how to upload and submit applications in the new preferred submission option, which is called Wisconsin Box. So you will no longer need to send me multiple emails to include all your attachments. It should be a much easier way to provide that information to us. If you do not want to send something electronically, please let us know that something will be coming in the mail. We do not get to the office as often as we used to, and we don't want to miss anything. We also updated and clarified the eligibility for local enforcement multiplier for permitted versus non-permitted MS4s. And thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions at this point.
Okay, we do have a few questions for you, Joanna.
All right.
The first question is land acquisition for flood storage and water quality improvements in an urban area an eligible grant activity?
So land acquisition is only eligible if it's required for the BMP for the project. We only pay for the water quality portion of the BMPs. I'm not sure I answered that. Corinne, do you have anything to add?
No, that's good. I confirmed this with Amy as well.
Okay.
And, essentially the focus of the urban non-point source grant projects again is on that stormwater quality. And so, yes, there is some overlap between flood control and stormwater quality, based BMPs. But it's really important that, if you've got a project where you've got some overlap between those two purposes, that you discuss that project with your regional non-point coordinator or stormwater staff person, and we'll handle that on a case by case basis. Land acquisition only for flood storage certainly would not be eligible. And so we want to see land acquisitions that's tied to one of those stormwater BMPs that's listed in the grant application.
Great, thank you both. The next question, and this one I can help out with too. So we have some people that joined a little late, so they were asking about whether or not the webinar and additional info would be available. So just as a reminder, we did record this webinar, and we'll be taking some time to process the recording and transcribing it, but we will be uploading it to YouTube and then sharing out those links. So we will definitely get that information out to everyone who was registered. Next question for you, Joanna. Is the American Rescue Plan Act funding eligible for local government cost share?
I think it depends on the funding source that we're talking about. Let's see, Kareem, do you know? I don't.
Well, I think in
know.
this case, again, this is that American Rescue Plan Act, this is federal funding. I think that it could be used as the local share, as long as obviously you're following the funding criteria for the ARPA funds. We're looking for, when you're mixing flavors of funding, that you are ensuring that you're bringing money to the table that is in fact eligible for those activities. We're scrutinizing obviously your project as it relates to eligibility for our funding, but you're going to want to make sure that you've got your I's dotted and T's crossed as it relates to the eligibility of the ARPA funding.
Right. And because we use state funds, it's okay to use federal funds as the local share.
Correct. Yep. When you start looking at targeted runoff management grants where we have a mix of federal and state funding at play, you can't mix federal with federal. So you can't have a grant that's funded by DNR with federal funding and then bring federal funding to the table as match. That goes against the federal funding guidelines. You can't match federal with federal.
All right. Looks like we've got some more questions that are coming in. Are green infrastructure BMPs such as permeable pavement an eligible grant activity?
Yes, so I can go back to the BMP list here. Hopefully I'm not making anyone too dizzy. All right, so here's an example. Permeable pavement is an eligible BMP.
And Amy pointed out that, you essentially want to find, in order to be eligible, we want to see an associated technical standard. As an example, green roofs are not eligible. So, we're looking to support practices that have a technical standard that kind of sets that bar of expectation for construction.
Right. I think I have a little. Eligible activities are here. Yep. So, right. So that just what you said, that they're either included in NR 154 or those that have technical standards developed and disseminated in accordance with NR 151.
Great. Would a conversion of a dry pond to a wet pond be eligible?
The answer is yes.
Very good. 1 second here. So let's see here. We've got a couple more. If I'm a municipality with a stormwater permit, but would like to install a BMP to improve local water quality and not to meet a permit requirement, is this project eligible for a grant? Do I have to prove that the project is not for permit compliance?
No, I mean, there are different options, especially if you're in,
I think
it's
it's
all for, I need to think about that one a little bit.
yeah, I think that when we're making the distinction between meeting a permit versus doing some sort of local priority, I think the door is open in the application to be able to select that kind of that local water quality option, but you're not going to score as many points for that particular question. That's my recollection in
Right.
terms of how we structured the application. You know, in terms of proving that it's not for permit compliance, by you checking the box to say that it's not for permit compliance is essentially you certifying that this project is for something other than permit compliance. So and it will be dependent on the project. So I think that's one of those things case by case that you're going to want to talk with your non-point source coordinator or your regional stormwater staff about.
All right. Very good. Well, that wraps up the questions that I'm seeing.
Actually, you know, Whitney, if you don't mind, could I circle back to one of the earlier questions?
Absolutely.
Okay, I did confirm what I originally thought. The whole question about acquiring land via eminent domain definitely is not eligible. Land can only be acquired from willing sellers in order to be eligible for the property acquisition funds in an urban non-point grant. And legal fees associated with that property acquisition are also not eligible. And if you're really, really excited about reading code, if you really get into that, some people do, weirdos like me, it's in NR 155.25. That's the section of the code dealing with property acquisition. And you can read up regarding what things are eligible, what costs are eligible versus what are not.
Great. And while you were chatting, we got another question that came in. I live on a lake that shares borders with Illinois. Who can I talk to about the details and if Illinois and Wisconsin partners can coordinate on lake issues?
I guess I would talk to the water quality biologist or water resource biologist in your area first. I'm not sure how that works with two different states.
Okay. Another question came in. How do we go about getting points for local funding if our current budget does not cover projects for 2023 or 2024?
When you're applying this year, you won't know the budget. Is that the question?
I think that's what they're getting at. Okay. Yes.
Yeah, and it's not very common for people to get those highest points in that category because of that reason. There are some cases that some municipalities have an approved budget already for the grant project, but in most cases they're not getting the full points.
It's usually they're getting points for having it in a proposed budget.
Yes.
Yeah. So you will get some points. It's just going to be fewer points.
Sounds good. Well, as we wait to see if we have any other last minute questions here, I'm going to just launch a quick poll. This is for Dan and I, our extension reporting. If you wouldn't mind taking a couple seconds to fill this out, that would be greatly appreciated. Again, for those who are going to be looking to review this webinar, it was recorded, and we will be processing that and getting it out to folks hopefully by the end of next week. Still not seeing any new questions coming in, unless Kareen or Dan, if you're getting questions to you guys. Joanna, did you have any last comments that you wanted to share?
No, I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us today, and definitely reach out if you have questions or think of them later. We'd be happy to answer them later. Wonderful.
Well, great job, Joanna. Oh, I have one other question here.
All right.
Let's see here. If I submit an application that scores low, is there an opportunity to review the application with the DNR, and can I resubmit the following year?
Yes, and we encourage that. We talk to many applicants after the fact. We meet with the Nonpoint source coordinator, usually the Nonpoint source coordinator plus Kareen and I, and we go over kind of areas to improve, and it's definitely encouraged to apply the following year.
Great.
Although I think it's not exactly the following year, because we're on a
Right.
Every other year. Yes, true.
And right. Good point.
Wonderful. Well, great job, Joanna. And thank you again to Kareen and Dan and Amy for helping behind the scenes. We appreciate everyone joining us today, and good luck with the applications.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.